Wherever there are shadows, there are people ready to kick at the darkness until it bleeds daylight. This is Bleeding Daylight with your host, Rodney Olson.
Welcome to this episode of Bleeding Daylight. If you're looking for more episodes, you'll find hundreds right now at bleedingdaylight.net. That's also where you'll find links for Bleeding Daylight on social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, YouTube and TikTok. I'd love to keep the conversation going with you there. Shame tells us that ridicule and rejection are waiting around the corner, while the truth is very often quite the opposite. Today's guest listened to the voice of shame for too many years, until he finally took steps that led him to freedom. He's now helping others discover that freedom too. Today's guest is someone whose story I think is really going to connect with you. Wesley Farnsworth is a storyteller, speaker, author and podcast host who spent 15 years in the US Air Force, documenting the world through a lens, from war zones to presidential inaugurations. But the story that changed everything for him didn't happen in front of a camera. It happened in the quiet, hidden places he tried to avoid for years. Wesley has walked through addiction, shame, a broken marriage, and the slow, honest work of rebuilding. He's turned that journey into a mission to help others take off their masks. He is the author of The Blueprint of Becoming, a practical guide to faith, failure, and finding your way forward, and the upcoming book, When Faith Meets Fire. Wesley, welcome to Bleeding Daylight.
Thank you so much, Rodney, for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
It seems to be a cliche, but we really do know that our childhoods shape who we are to become. I know that your childhood carried a lot of expectations. Can you tell me a bit about those growing up years?
Yeah, I grew up in a pastor's home. My dad was a full-time evangelist. If you're not familiar with the term, evangelist is essentially a traveling pastor. So he grew up traveling the country, speaking at whatever church would have him. My mom was in ministry as well. I often joke that the church was a family business. If the church was open, we were there. I grew up in the faith. I grew up believing in God. I grew up trusting that He will provide, and that was demonstrated time and time again. It's just the way we were brought up. One of four boys. My mom had her hands full. My oldest brother is about 11 years older than I am, so he was out of the house pretty early compared to me. So there's three of us left at home. So that's kind of my upbringing in a nutshell.
Being the child of parents in ministry, it does bring expectations, certain ways that you're meant to behave and certain ways that you're meant to act. What sort of an effect did that have on you?
The expectations, it's funny you mention that because I feel like some of those expectations are not spoken. They're unwritten expectations. And some of them are self-imposed. I know for me, that's kind of the way it was. Nobody ever told us, hey, you have to act this way and say these things and do these things. But I certainly put those pressures on myself because I wanted to make sure I was reflecting positively on not only my dad and my mom, but the church and God. I definitely lived with some self-imposed pressures to make sure that I was reflecting positively on everybody.
While I'm sure it was never preached by your father or your mother, did you grow up expecting that Christianity was a performance-based faith, that you had to perform and that's what it was all about?
No, I never did believe that. I knew that there was more to faith than performance, not only from my own personal faith, but from the faith that was demonstrated to me through my family, through the churches that we attended. So it was pretty clear that faith and relationship with God was more than just performance-based.
It would have given you such a great opportunity to see different churches in action, to see the wider body of Christ in action. But did you miss having a real solid spiritual home during those years?
I would say I did have a solid spiritual home. I grew up in the church, having two parents in ministry. We were always rooted in our faith. We would at times travel with my dad to churches when he would speak. So I wasn't always just at one church. We had a few different churches growing up, plus the times we would travel with him when he was speaking. I would say that I did grow up in a very well-rounded, spiritual, faith, God-believing household.
As we fast forward, we see that you're taking photos, you're behind the camera and capturing some amazing moments. What led you into that?
That happened in 2007. I had decided to enlist in the Air Force. When you enlist in the U.S. military, you go to the processing station and you do your physical and everything. And at some point, you sit down and you fill out a sheet of what jobs that you would like to do. And they call that your dream sheet. While I was filling my dream sheet out, I had photography listed as my number one. The person that was running the section came up to me and said, "You can leave it as that, but I would highly recommend you take it off as your number one because it's a very small job. I've never seen it become available, and so the chances of you getting it are slim to none. So it would be a wasted number one slot because they try and pair you with your number one slot." And I said, "Okay, I appreciate the information," and I moved it down to my number two. A couple weeks later, the list comes out of available jobs and my recruiter calls me and he says, "Hey, I need you to come in." And I come in the door, and as I'm walking in the door, he looks at me and he says, "Farnsworth, who do you know and how much did you have to pay him?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Who do you know and how much did you have to pay him?" "What do you mean, Sergeant?" He proceeds to tell me all the years this person up at the recruiting station had been doing the job, and in all of his time as a recruiter, they had never seen this job come available. It just happened to come available when I was going through, and I got matched with it. That is totally a God thing. It opened up so many doors while I was in. I was able to do so many amazing things. I was in Afghanistan for a while. I did a presidential inauguration here in the United States. I was able to photograph many different things like foreign heads of states, military government leadership at all levels, sporting events at every level. I truly, truly had a blessed career. The best part of it was just being able to photograph and tell the stories of the other men and women in uniform and being able to share a glimpse and insight into what they were doing with the people back home.
So it seems that life is going along very successfully, but what's happening in the background for you at this time?
Yeah, in the background, that's another story. On the outside, it looks like I've got it all together. But in the inside, I'm broken. I am hurting. To get to that, we kind of have to backtrack a little bit. I'm probably 15, 16 years old at this point. I'm out with some friends one day, and one of them shares a word. He says a word. All of my friends start laughing. Of course, I start laughing with them because I want to fit in. I had no idea what they were talking about. So I come back home that night. I tell myself I need to figure out what this term is so that if they start talking about it again, I can have some idea of what it is so that I can fit in and be accepted. Because a part of my upbringing and a part of my wanting to make sure I was reflecting well on everybody as a pastor's kid was I wanted to fit in with everybody. I wanted to be somebody that people could talk to. That was my personal goal. I went home and I searched this term so that I could fit in with my quote unquote friends. That search that night opened up the door of adult content to me. It was something that I would battle for the next 20 years. I would go for different stints of time trying to fix it on my own, and I would find success for different lengths of time. But for one reason or another, I would go back to it. It wasn't until around 2019, 2020, when I finally had enough. I knew that I couldn't do it on my own any longer. I had tried for so long, it just wasn't working, and I knew something had to change. It was at that time that the church that I was attending announced that they were starting this new ministry called Celebrate Recovery. I was like, oh, cool, recovery, but that's not for me, right? You hear recovery, you think drugs and alcohol. So at first I kind of started to play it off, and then they went in and they started talking about how it's for anybody, no matter what you're dealing with, any kind of hurt, habit, hang up, addiction, whatever it is. If you're alive and breathing, it's for you. So at first I was like, okay, yeah, that sounds kind of cool. Maybe I should check that out. It took me a couple of months to kind of work up the courage, because part of me wanting to fit in is also me wanting to be accepted. On the inside, I have this internal battle of going, well, I'm not going to go here and admit that I'm struggling with this thing, because if I do, what are they going to think of me? What are they going to say about me? What's going to happen? So I kind of fought it for a while. I got to the point where I said to myself, screw it. What happens, happens. I need to do something. Something has to change. So I told myself I'm going to sit in the back row and I'm not going to speak to anybody. And then I'll leave and I can say it wasn't for me and I tried it. I gave myself an out. Well, obviously that didn't work out for me. That night I attended their introductory meeting just to find out more about the ministry. And the leader looked at me and he said, "What brings you in tonight?" I said, "Codependency." Now, prior to this night, I had never heard the term codependency before in my entire life. But it was explained that night by somebody on stage that essentially codependency is caring more about what other people think about you than what you think about yourself, and more importantly, what God thinks about you. AKA, you're a people pleaser. You want to be accepted. And I was like, hey, that's me. It didn't sound as bad as dealing with adult content, pornography. He says, thanks for sharing that. And he stops, he turns and picks up the leader's book, and then he stops again and he looks at me and he says, is there anything else? Now, I can tell you as a leader of Celebrate Recovery today, that question is not in the leader's guide anywhere to ask. It was totally a God thing. And it was in that moment that the dam broke. I found myself blurting out the secret that I'd been holding back for so long. And this tidal wave of tears just began streaming down my face. I'm sobbing. And at the same time, I'm also bracing myself. Because prior to walking in, I was told by the enemy, the devil, everything that was going to happen. That I was going to be shamed. I was going to be rejected. I was going to be told I had to leave the church. I was going to do this. This was going to happen. That was going to happen. And so I began bracing myself for this reaction. But the complete opposite happened. Instead of getting rejection, I was accepted. Instead of being talked down to, I was talked to with love. And the only thing I heard was, thank you for sharing that. You're a brave man. It was in that moment of sobbing and blurting the secret out and having that reaction to what I had just shared from this gentleman sitting across from me, that the switch was flipped in my head. And this addiction that I had been struggling with for so many years was gone. As I look back on it, I realize I was trying to do God's work the entire time. I was trying to fix me, myself, and instead of letting him take control and do it. Scripture says that we're supposed to admit our sins and the exact nature of our wrongs to another human being. And that's what I'd been holding back. I'd done everything else that I knew to do to fix myself, except for that, because I couldn't bring myself to do it. But it was in that moment that I chose to finally let go, and I did that I believe I found the healing.
That was obviously the start of a journey, but it didn't mean that life went swimmingly well after that. What was happening at home for you at this stage?
Everything was fine at home. After some self-work and stuff, it did come out. I did tell my wife at the time, but since then, we have parted ways, I guess you could say.
Where did the recovery go? You said that it was in that moment that you felt that something had broken, that the addiction was broken. But was there continuing work that you did within that group? Obviously now you're a leader of Celebrate Recovery, so it's something that you continue to go through. What was the journey like for you from there?
The journey of Celebrate Recovery, the journey of my recovery, is a long process. There's a lot of work that you have to do, a lot of hard work that you have to do to kind of begin to unpack the reason that you're there. For me, it took many years. I'm still unpacking it to this day. Somebody will say something and it'll trigger a thought in your head about your recovery. But for me, it took me a few years to be able to kind of unpack it and realize that the addiction was actually a symptom of a deeper issue. really that issue was codependency. As far as I can tell, that's the root issue right now. And that was because I got into the addiction to fit in with to fit in with the crowd at work. It took me a while to be able to kind of unpack that and to come to terms with that. Throughout that journey, you're shown a lot of different things as you begin to unpack your life and look back at your past and even your present, and you begin to realize, oh man, I kind of fell short in this area. I need to go and make amends for this. I need to go and talk to this person and figure out how to make things better. I need to maybe cut this thing out of my life or that thing out of my life so that I can stop doing this or that. There's a lot of changes that you'd start to make in your life in order to step into the person that God is calling you to be.
One of the things you touched on there that is something that holds us back so often is that idea of shame and the enemy's use of shame, in that we play a script through our mind of, if I take this action, this is what will happen. And so we play it forward in our mind and we think, I can't afford to go there. And yet, as you say, the opposite happened. How often do you think shame is holding people back from what they could be?
I think it happens every day at some level. The enemy wants us to live in shame. And that's our natural instinct, I think, is when somebody asks us to do something or we know we need to do something, we instantly start playing out in our head. And our head never goes to, it's going to be all sunshine and rainbows. Our brains will automatically go to doom and gloom. I attribute that to the fact that we are broken people living in a broken world. It takes conscious effort and strength to begin to reprogram your brain to try and look at the positive side of things instead of the negative. I still struggle with it today, and I think I always will because I'm human.
I've certainly spoken to a lot of people who have been held back by shame and actually found that when they confront the issue that they're dealing with, it doesn't go according to the script that they've had in their head. Now, as you continue to work with Celebrate Recovery, I'm sure that you've seen that breakthrough for a lot of people. And it must be incredibly empowering for them to know that when they do break through that shame barrier, that there's something better waiting for them on the other side.
Yeah, it is so powerful. That is the one thing I love about this ministry. I've been free now for almost 8 years of my addiction, but I keep going back every single week because I love not only the relationships that I get to form with the other people and the fact that I'm part of a community where it's okay to not be okay. And I'm able to talk about the things that I'm struggling with that week or whatever. But I also get to see life change happen every week. I get to see people go from broken to healed and kind of watch their journey over the weeks, months, years as they're a part of the program. It's so rewarding to see, and I can't take credit for it because it's not me. But just being a part of it and being able to be there and walk alongside them and encourage them and see the life change happen is just so amazing.
Tell me a little about the writing of the Blueprint of Becoming. What was behind that, and what would people find between the pages of that book?
Yeah, so the Blueprint of Becoming actually is a result of my journey in Celebrate Recovery and God's prompting. After a while of attending Celebrate Recovery, I started sharing my testimony, and that is talking about my addiction and my journey growing up and my journey through the addiction and now on the other side of it. As I began sharing my testimony, I was in CR one night. I was in a meeting and somebody was giving their testimony. They said something that prompted this thought to run through my head. I just felt God saying, you need to share your testimony outside of CR. I remember talking to him, I'm like, you want me to do what? Within CR, I'm okay sharing my testimony because I have anonymity and confidentiality there. Nobody's going to leave there and talk about what they heard me say. And now you want me to share it outside where I don't have that. That's kind of scary for somebody that wants the approval and be accepted by everybody because you have no control over what other people are going to think, say, or do. But he's like, yeah, this is what you're going to do. This person shared this part of their testimony, and it kind of cued this scene from the movie A Knight's Tale. The scene just kept replaying in my head over and over and over again. And in this scene, there's a little boy sitting on the side of the road with his dad along a parade route. there's a parade of knights coming down the road, and there's a knight on his horse, and his armor is glistening and shiny and all that fun stuff. And the little boy looks to his dad and he says, "Dad, I want to be like him someday. I want to be like that knight." And the dad, of course, like any good parent, encourages his son, and he says, "You know what? You can do that. If that's what you want to do, you go and do that, son." Another guy hears this conversation and gives his unwanted input. He looks to the boy and he says, "No, you can't do that. You're a peasant boy. You can't change your stars and become a knight. You can't become a part of the royal family, the kingdom. You're a peasant boy and you'll always be one." For whatever reason, the scene, like I said, just kept playing in my head over and over again. Eventually, the words began to shift in my head. God began to tell me and show me that, you know what, you're like that peasant boy. When you're dealing with things and you're away from me, you're like that peasant boy. You know you want to change, but you don't know how. And eventually, when you find me and you give it over to me and you accept me as your savior, you do change your stars and you now become a part of the royal family. You become part of the kingdom. I'm like, man, I love that thought, that process, that scene. And so then the idea of changing your stars began to circle and play in my head like a broken record. That's kind of where the analogy for the book comes from. In the book, I use the analogy of the stars as a path in our lives. Every decision we make, every job that we have, every relationship we have, everything we do is a star in the constellation of our life. When you think about stars, I think about nautical times, and I think about ships that are trying to navigate. And what do they navigate by? They navigate by stars. And they use the North Star as their main star for navigation. Our life is the same way. God began to show me how everything in our life is a star, but He needs to be our North Star. And when our North Star is Him, everything else will kind of fall into line, and we'll be walking in the blueprint that He has for our lives. We'll be able to make decisions that are in line with what He wants for us. But when we get off course and we allow another thing to become our North Star, now our ship is drifting off course, our life is drifting off course, and now we have to do something to realign it. As I began writing the book, the first couple of chapters is my life story, is my testimony. The rest of the book, we look at biblical characters and their stories, people that by the world standards, even today, we would say are not qualified. They're not qualified to lead. They're not qualified to be a religious figure, a big person, or anything like that. Yet they're some of the biggest names in the Bible. We look at their story about where they came from and how they were used by God because they said yes. At the end of every chapter, I give you different things that you can do to begin to examine your own life and begin to identify as you're going through the book things that might need to change in your life. And then towards the end, I give you a chapter that's completely tools that you can begin to use in order to not only identify the areas, but then how to begin the change of removing them and making sure that your life is on course.
As you've taken your testimony out of the Celebrate Recovery group and you've taken it to speaking engagements and then sharing it through this book, I'm sure that there have been other people that it's unlocked something for them, that they've been able to share with you their moment of breakthrough. That must be a real encouragement for you as you see God using what you're putting out there to bring people closer to Him.
Yeah, it is so rewarding. I love going to events and I'll hear somebody say something and it will just trigger me and I'll start sharing my story. Or maybe I'm invited to share my story. I'll share the story and the things that I've been through, the addiction that I struggled with. And 10 out of 10 times, I have somebody come up to me and they say, "You know what? I've been there," or "I'm going through that right now. Can we talk?" And I'm able to go and pull them aside and we have a good conversation around it. And I'm able to encourage them and provide advice, because the one thing I have found is that when you're willing to step into the discomfort and you're willing to share the things that you have been through or the things that you're going through right now, that in turn gives somebody else the permission to do the same thing. But when you choose to live in shame and you choose to live in fear, the enemy has a stronghold in your life. He wants us to live in shame and fear because then it keeps us from talking about the things that God has done in our life. And when we do that, we're not giving the glory to God for the things that he's done in our life. So when we step into the discomfort and we share those things, then we're sharing and we're stepping into the light. And when we're in the light, the enemy has no hold. And it begins to give people the permission and the courage to step into the light with you and talk about the things that they're struggling with.
You have another book in the works called When Faith Meets Fire. Tell me a little about that one.
When Faith Meets Fire, it's scheduled to come out fall of 26. September is what I'm shooting for. 2025, I spent 9 months unemployed. And month after month, time after time, I saw God provide for one reason or another in one way or another. I had a lot of people ask me, how do you keep your faith during this time? I wish I had faith like yours. Where does it come from? How did you get here? This book is kind of an answer to those questions. I share parts of my testimony in it, and I kind of share the journey of building faith and how to keep your faith in the hard times when things are not going the way that you want them to, when your faith is truly meeting the fire. It's kind of what this book is all about. It's just an encouragement to people that God doesn't promise that when you come to him and you accept him in your life, that life is always going to be easy. But he never leaves you, he never forsakes you, and he will always be with you. So it's an encouragement to keep the faith, even in the hard times.
Obviously, we're living in strange times. We see things going on around about us that we don't quite understand, that test our faith. And then personally, we will all go through things, whether it is a bad diagnosis, the loss of a loved one, a breakdown of a relationship. Is this book going to be an encouragement to people who are going through any of those kinds of scenarios?
Absolutely. I truly believe this book will be an encouragement to anybody, no matter the lifestyle or the thing that you're going through. I not only talk about the loss of my job in there, but I also talk about my faith during a time when my dad became ill, and it took over a year for them to diagnose it as a stroke. And then the journey that kind of followed that, where he spent the rest of his life trying to recover from that stroke and many others that kind of followed it before he ultimately passed away after many years of battling it. But I talk about my faith a little bit in there, about how it was built through that journey, through an illness that impacted my life in some very, very big ways.
You've obviously been through many fires of your own, and you're going to be helping people to go through their own fire, as you've already been doing through the initial book, The Blueprint of Becoming, as well as your work with Celebrate Recovery. And there is a link to your website in the show notes at bleedingdaylight.net so that people can find you. They can find your current book, but also find When Faith Meets Fire when that's released. I just want to say thank you, Wesley, for sharing some of your story. Thank you for spending some time with us today on Bleeding Daylight.
You know, it is my pleasure. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in finding me, go out to the link in the show notes, wesleyfarnsworth.com. Not only can you find the information about me as Rodney shared, but I also have some freebies out there that you can go out there and either download or drop your email in, and I'll email them to you as a way of saying thank you for contacting me.
Thank you for listening to Bleeding Daylight. Please help us to shine more light into the darkness by sharing this episode with others. For further details and more episodes, please visit bleedingdaylight.net.